Hello and welcome everybody to the latest cyber insurance roundup. I am Stephen Legg, the CEO and co-founder of Antigen Security, and I am joined as always by the amazing and intelligent Kirsten Bay.
Pleasure to be here as always.
Thank you, Kirsten. So today I wanted to kind of kick us off talking about something that's been a regular ongoing topic, but get a little bit more practical about it. I don't know for folks that are watching, if you pay attention to the insurance brokerage world, the broker Marsh, who's a relatively large player in that space, puts out quarterly reports on a regular basis on what their insured are doing, what the observations they're seeing from that side of the industry, and they've raised some interesting stats, and one in particular I wanted to call out, talking about our topic today. So in that report, Kirsten, you and I talked a little bit about one of the big conclusions being one that cyber insurance premiums are they're finding a balance, I think, finally a little bit.
Mhm.
But one of the main levers that's causing that balance to occur from the perspective of Marsh in this report was an emphasis and leaning into good cyber hygiene. So I'm curious, from your perspective in this industry, what do you see, and do you think good cyber hygiene is kind of the right path, moving forward down that path?
Well, you know what I'm going to say, of course, is the answer. Um, it's really the thesis, of course, of what we do as an organization, that we put cyber controls first and then we write around them and we measure them. So it is really wonderful to see validation, but of course we know that that should have been the outcome, right? And so
Mhm.
what's more important, I think, is focusing on how we continue to measure, how we continue to prove, how we continue to improve, and how we continue to get people to not only check those boxes because they've done it, but actually go through a verification process where there is a continuous compliance component where we are able to measure efficacy from the point of looking at an IOC or indicator of compromise and how we can remediate those rapidly to measure that in relationship to then full scale breaches. And I think what we can really start to get to is in the relationship to what question between breaches and cyber hygiene starting to reduce the severity and impact of events.
Completely agree, and I think you drew a conclusion inside of that that's especially important, and that's the relationship between those, whether it's a 0 day, whether it's a new vulnerability, whether it's a specific attack being levied by a particular threat actor or family of threat actors. The analysis, understanding, and then response to those points of learning, I think, are especially important. I'm curious, because we have a lot of folks in the IT services space, and work with a lot of those folks, both of us. What are your thoughts on how that conversation changes when you're not only responsible for your own risk, but responsible for a portfolio of risk?
Well, certainly insurability and premiums in that particular group are
Mhm.
still very unstable, and so it's one of those things where it's nice to see in general that the market is leveling off. I mean, we're leveling off at a rate where we've already experienced triple to quadruple digits in terms of increases. So it's not like we're not reverting to lower premiums, but we're not seeing the increases that we've seen in the past. MSPs unfortunately don't really belong to that group. We are still seeing increases, particularly for their own coverages, because of the point you just made, which is that they're responsible for a bunch of organizations. And it hasn't yet been proven out that they are writ large reducing the exposure to their own organizations from a supply chain perspective. So the proving out of that is a little bit slower or has leveled off, but there's still this anxiety around, do we have it right yet? I think certainly one of the things that we know is there were a lot of MSPs, and particularly who were not putting MFA in their RMM tools, and that really had very broad level implications. So we have seen a lot of privilege access management, identity and access management improvements there that I think really have impacted the losses that we've seen. But when I do talk to carriers, we're still seeing that when incidents are occurring at MSPs, it's not
Mhm.
like, oh no, this bad thing happened. It's like, oh my gosh, another catastrophe. And so that's the thing I think that we really need to start paying attention to is how do we help dial back the severity of those incidents, because when they're getting hit, they're still incredibly severe losses. And so it's in relationship to managing their own premiums and being able to become insured, but also how they manage their liability and being able to prove to their clients that they're protected in the right way.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I think what's interesting there is that a lot of the things that we've talked about in the past and that we continue to talk about as we work together in this industry are really things that directly touch on and address a lot of that points. I get asked all the time by MSPs, well, how do I sell security? How do I use insurance to sell security services and do all these things? It's like, well, guys, let's take a step back and stop looking at things like they're widgets, and let's first start the same way that I recommend that somebody looking to transition, as an example, from technology to security as a discipline might do this. Start at home. Look at those frameworks, look at the like industry frameworks, look at the security controls that enterprises and larger organizations are implement those in your own backyard, get that muscle memory, get that practice, understand what your risks are and how to quantify them, and how to craft intelligent contingencies and responses, and also layering your defense in a defense in depth manner around those risks. And that's really kind of the conduit to doing everything else. I hate to repeat myself, but it's one of those things that until you've gone down that road, if you're still thinking that product or any particular one piece of that, what should be a fabric of risk mitigation measures, is the solution to all of it, you're going to be left in one of those disaster scenarios, and that's what everyone wants to avoid. But the MSPs obviously don't want to make those claims, and the insurers don't want to pay them out. So the meet in the middle solution, I think, is the apex of all of those ideas. But inside of that, Kirsten, the I guess what I'm interested in hearing from you is what frustrations you hear from MSPs that are going down that journey, trying to get insured, because it's not just cyber insurance from their perspective, right? That they need. They also need technology errors and emissions and others, sometimes other forms of coverage, depending on what their client base is. What do you see kind of on that side of the world?
Well, there are two things. One is from their own standpoint, the biggest pain point for them is the complexity of applications that they get and how rapidly they change. And we've talked about this a lot, where a bad thing happens, another crazy question ends up in the questionnaire. And sometimes they aren't crazy questions, sometimes they are good questions, but they're to your point specific questions, as opposed to more how are you developing your architecture such that you have defense in depth, and what is the strategy around that. That's really ultimately the question that we're trying to get the answer to, so that when they go through underwriting, how do we properly understand if there's segmentation in a way that we can't have a broad level wholesale loss. And a lot of the applications we're seeing still aren't getting there, and so the applications are getting longer, but the MSPs feel like they're not getting to the right answer, and then they fill these big long things out, and then they're declined for coverage. And so it's like, gosh, it took me like 3 weeks to get through this thing, get through this underwriting thing, and then you say no. And so that is a real frustration, because they're really trying to do the things that they think should be done,
Mhm.
but it's not really, for depending on the size of the organization, right? For MSPs who are over 10 million in annual revenue, it's still a very serious pain point. As it relates to then working with their customers, I was recently at the Kaseya Connect IT conference, and I had several of them tell me that they're spending $40,000 to $50,000 a year worth of their own time doing applications for their customers. They
Mm-hmm.
worry about the liability that they're incurring by filling these things out, though they own the infrastructure. So, it's like, I think in summation, they feel like they spend half their lives filling out these crazy applications, and what's the benefit and how are they really helping themselves and their customers? And I think that that's something that they're trying to be the best stewards, but how do we help them be more effective and really demonstrate, to the point that you made at the beginning of this discussion, that these controls are managing the potential risks in such a way that they're deserving of discounts and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Um, we hear similar things from our MSP partners in the communities that we belong to, and I would say I think one of the big questions that often comes up is, what does a healthy security program for an MSP internally actually look like? And from my perspective, it's, and this is not an exhaustive list, but these couple particular points are really key, and you touched on them when you were talking about identity and access management and privileged access management, because those two worlds of controls and how you apply them, although they don't have to be terribly complex, if you don't achieve the key outcomes of being able to, one, to the point that you raised, segmentation, segment the risk between the technology platforms, whether it's an RMM, your EDR, your MDR, whatever has kind of larger scale access to all of your customer environments. If you're not securing that in a way that allows you to flip access, reset passwords, put yourself in a position where even if you have an employee that gets terminated, if there's an individual account that's compromised, or if there's any other event that occurs that would put you in a position where those credentials put the entire customer base at risk, if you don't have the levers to pull to deal with that relatively quickly and actually have a definitive response to it that resets that access, provides new credentials across the board, and locks out anyone who might have gotten unauthorized access appropriately, I think you're always going to be kind of behind the eight ball on any of those really nightmare situations that could come up. And there's not a lot of people talking about that, and it's surprising to me because just like MFA for all organizations is really critical and kind of a bread and butter control that addresses, when it's implemented correctly, an overwhelming majority of initial access scenarios for a mid-level or mid-market enterprise, which really, like, if you look at an MSP internally and what type of organization they resemble most closely, it's more like a mid or large size business with the
Mhm.
complexities and security demands of a mid or large size business. And that's really what they have to solve for. And a lot of them think of themselves like their customers, even for those smaller MSPs under like 5 million in revenue that are exclusively working in SMB circles. Their biggest customer might be 30 to 50 users, and their smallest might be 1 to 5 or something like that. um, those organizations still don't think of themselves as a more complex risk than their customers, and that's a big misnomer, I think, in the way that they kind of think about and conceptualize their security architecture. I'm curious, especially since you've been to Kaseya Connect and some other events recently in that space. Are you hearing MSPs talk about this at all? Are they aware of this? What is your general kind of sense of where they land on that conversation?
That certainly, that it's an evolving viewpoint, and I think they're recognizing it. I think one of the big challenges for them is just feeling constrained for time. It's sort of like, the cobbler's children go barefoot kind of scenario, where they spend so much time trying to do the right things for their customers that they do forget that they are in a different architecture world, but they also feel the pinch of being a small business, like many of us feel like the pinch of being a small business. So there is definitely that dichotomy between those 2 points.
Mm,
But certainly, I also am seeing a lot of transition to outsourcing security functions, to be able to catch up, so that they realize that, look, I need to outsource this portion of the function so that we can be secure, our customers can be secure, and then we'll focus on the IT aspects of it, but integrate that into our suite so that there's continuity. And I am seeing a large portion of them starting to move in that direction, especially the smaller shops, just because there's just too much spread otherwise to manage. And I think that they're realizing that it's too much of a lift to try to do all those things and be able to do them well. So
Mhm.
that's, like most small businesses, when you start to feel that constrained, you realize what's the thing that I'm going to get the most lift out of in terms of value to my customer base to outsource, but that I can control and leverage and make sure that it's good for all of us.
Makes total sense. Yeah, I appreciate that insight. I think an interesting that is an interesting conclusion that you drew, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying, or what we were talking about with how they assist their customers in obtaining insurance. If they go to folks that essentially have that figured out, get engaged, essentially have those blueprints kind of predefined in a way that enables them to focus on what they're really great at for their customers, and puts them in a position where they're able to achieve that reasonably without, to your point, breaking the budget, spending tons of cycles that are going unpaid, or putting them in a position where they're essentially eating their arm to provide this function to themselves and their customers. I think that is the direction that I see many MSPs going at this point, in general. And the question I have for you inside of that is, when it comes to kind of, I guess the phrase I would use is playing to, or teaching to the test.
Right.
What is the danger that you see for those organizations that are adopting that are going out for that, for their cyber and tech coverage, and what is the right, I guess, what approach would you recommend they take inside of that for themselves as a precursor to getting engaged with, a third party that might specialize in that kind of a relationship?
It's a good question because while I've said many times in our discussions that I caution everybody to not use their insurance application as a means of setting controls or checking the box. For MSPs, it is a good way to look at sort of the high level requirements because, and rightly, they've been focused on PAM particularly, which is something that I think we all would agree for MSPs is a really important component, and one that I think is still being explored and understood by that community. And so I think that that's one area. But again, like we talk about, that's sort of the beginning of defense in depth, right? Because those are the areas where then we can start to segment beyond that. But privileged access, privileged escalation, those are the areas that we know are the most dangerous. And so we are seeing again another rash of credential stuffing as a means of attempting to attack, and they are again becoming successful. And so part of what we know with the supply chain attacks where they're attacking manufacturing or MSPs, right? Where similar architecture, that we have to be very, very careful about the way we're doing implementations in those environments, to think very closely about how quickly can they spread and how do we quarantine particular attacks rapidly and identify them rapidly. And so it's PAM, it's mean time to detection, mean time to remediation, and of course segmentation. Those are the four most important ones that we're seeing. And that applies to healthcare too, because you could swap them out almost interchangeably in terms of what those risks look like and how they all kind of sit in the same risk bucket when carriers look at it, because they see the potential sort of massive and quick infection rate that spreads across an organization.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that correlation between those two types of organizations is really interesting. And also, it's not surprising to me that insurers relate those two, because, in the world of incident response and breaches that affect organizations like that, just like an MSP, a healthcare organization is kind of a multi-headed beast, right? Like they have so much PII, so much PHI, and so many different systems because of the nature of what they do, they have to kind of think about it the same way. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with how MSPs need to think of themselves not as a small business, even if they are a small business from a staffing and revenue perspective, but from a risk perspective, they really do kind of have more of a need for a layered and intelligent approach. So, Kirsten, I guess inside of the insurability conversation, um, what are there any trends? Are there any, I guess, common steps that those MSPs are taking? You mentioned privilege access. You mentioned a number of other things in the response that you just provided. But where should they go? What should they do? What types of what types of non-technical exercises could they engage in to kind of prep them for some of those larger undertakings?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, one certainly is even tabletop exercises, right? The pen testing, which is technical, but useful, right? To make sure that there aren't other holes that they aren't seeing or thinking about. But the tabletop exercises are important. We do actually see a lot of MSPs who aren't entirely prepared for incidents, and either for their customers or for themselves. And so, really getting focused on those fire drills, I think, is an important feature for them to think about, and also to be doing with their customers, because people still click on links, and some of those links are still bad, and so it's really prioritizing and identifying the best way to work through an incident. And I would say that for many MSPs are making this transition, as they should be, to offering larger security packages. And for a long time, they were infrastructure people, and so they need to make that transition and thinking more broadly about what does that incident response look like for a much larger infrastructure than just a very segmented piece. Backups were hit, or availability. I work a lot with organizations that were copier companies, so they have a really strong and big footprint there, and are spreading into IT management and security as managed services are starting to evolve. So you have a lot of organizations who are big organizations who are really starting to change their profile and need to think differently about how they manage their customer base than they have before. And that's a transition that they're going through and thinking very strategically about. So I think they deserve credit for it as well. But that's one area I think to start.
Yeah, no, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think a lot of MSPs have never even thought about doing a tabletop, and I wouldn't say most, many do not have any sort of incident response plan that's actually actionable. And just like I often tell folks when they're talking about or asking about their disaster recovery and business continuity plans, if you haven't tested it, what you have is a theory. You don't have an actual workable plan that you know will function in the way that you need it to when the bad thing happens. And so whether you're talking about the steps that you need to take to triage initially, to contain, to retake control or eradicate that threat actor influence on one or many assets, knowing how and what you need to recover, having an immutable backup strategy, and ensuring that that is aligned with kind of all those other life cycles of activity that could come up during an incident. Really, that whole conversation becomes a conversation not just about incident response, but about being resilient as an organization from a cyber perspective. And kind of going back to the Marsh report, I think that's the eye-opening moment I think a lot of folks in this industry have been having in the last 12 to 18 months, realizing with many of the studies that have come out proving this empirically with data, that cyber hygiene and effective and effectively implemented security architectures actually make not only a difference, but can often put you in a position where you can contain and respond to things that would ordinarily escalate and get very bad or be some kind of a nightmare scenario before they ever have an opportunity to do that. But the only way to do that is to do what you mentioned, align with controls. Don't play to the test, play to the framework. um, you know, go through those tabletops, think about those practical questions before you're in the trenches, and then walk through it all with folks that really know how to secure those type of kind of multifaceted, more enterprise-like risk profile organizations like MSPs. Um, great response, Kirsten, and thank you for that input. I guess the final question I have for you before we wrap up here is from a going back to the conversation about spending 40 to 50,000 a year on filling out those questionnaires. The liability conversation is a whole kind of topic in and of itself. But what do you think those MSPs can do to reduce that time spent, put themselves in a position where they're not spending a lot of those cycles repetitively, in many cases, filling out this questionnaire, that questionnaire? What do you see as a good strategy for responding to that?
Well, I mean, there are, different insurance programs where one can standardize. So I think the standardization, so, forming a partnership with a brokerage or an organization would certainly be helpful. A lot of MSPs are reticent to try to support the acquisition portion of, um, oh, are you still there? Yes. All right, I
I
had
am
a
here.
little glitch. Sorry, a
No
little
problem.
glitch. Um, to get in the insurance game. But I think for a lot of smaller organizations, having that level of help from their MSP would be appreciated, right? And so being able to align controls with these are the programs. Certainly, I know that a lot of MSPs get deal flow from brokers as well. So, being able to create alignment around those things would be a great service to everybody. And so I think more and more we're moving in those directions. And I think that the other thing I was going to comment on when we're talking about some of these other controls and expanding to the security footprint is that MSPs need not be afraid to ask for additional dollars to bring that level of value to their customer, whether it's a cyber insurance policy or whether it's a security program of those embedded together. This is the stuff that creates real value for customers. And for smaller customers, they're still on that journey of accepting that they're in the same bucket as larger organizations. But
Mhm.
that change is rapidly happening, as you called out with the Marsh report. And so don't be afraid to hold your ground. And I see a lot more MSPs saying, look, if you don't have cyber insurance, you can't even be my customer. So
Mhm.
it's liability, it's also recovery, but that these things are now intrinsically linked, and being able to work together to get to that next end state is the path that we're all on together.
Completely agreed. I think that takeaway in particular is one that I often say to MSPs that are coming back to me and complaining of customers complaining about pricing or this or that. Like, everybody understands inflation, everybody understands all these pieces, but there is a very real correlation in the rise of cyber insurance premiums and the increase in the demand on security budgets for all organizations. And really, to your point, you and what a lot of MSPs, the stance that they're taking now that we've seen is very much what you said, that we will not accept you as a customer if you don't have these measures in place. The security stack, having a cyber risk program truly that is all encompassing and aspires to a defense in depth approach and actually achieves it, is kind of the base level requirement now. That's going back to the conversation about other forms of insurance. That's essentially your cyber seatbelt. And if you don't have it, then you can't ride. That's just how it works. And I think that's really going to help broaden the adoption of security and cyber risk management across the business community in general. But I think the MSPs are the tip of the spear in that conversation. So really appreciate that insight, Kirsten. Well, Kirsten, thank you again so much for joining us today. Were there any final thoughts you wanted to leave the audience with?
No, I thank you very much as always for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. And it continues to evolve, and we look forward to having more discussions about what's going to happen next month, because you never know. That's always the exciting thing about what we talk about.
Hmm. Absolutely. Well, and for those that are tuning in, keep an eye out for a big announcement from Cysurance and Antigen in the very near future.
Yes, indeed.
I hope everybody has a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you.